Please join me in welcoming my former boss, the Honorable Robert O. Work.
Admiral Barrera, General Dunford, John, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Ambassador Peters, distinguished flags, friends of the Department of the Navy, and to the students who are graduating this Friday, both American and foreign, it is such a pleasure to be here today. The Undersecretary of the Navy, the first day that I took over my job, I came into my office, and there on the desk was an envelope. And it said, "Open for a description of the Undersecretary's duties." So I opened it up, and it said, "See tethered goat at Jurassic Park." I hardly ever get out of the building. And so when the Secretary called me up, and he said, "Bob, I'm going to be out of the country. Would you mind going to Newport, Rhode Island, and representing me at the Current Strategy Forum?" I thought I was getting punked. I said, "Is this Ashton Kutcher?" I said, "Of course I would." To come to the altar of sea power in the church that Luce and Mahan built, I said, this is beyond my wildest dreams. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell all of you where I really believe we are in this strategic moment in time. And I believe in my heart that we're on the verge of a golden age of American sea power. Now, everyone in this audience is worried about sequestration, about the budget cuts, about all of these things. But I want to make a case this morning that is not nearly as dark as you might think. Now, I'm going to speak most of the time because I'm so invested in here. I'm going to stay here the full 2 days. I'll be here at every break. I'll be there tonight for 2 hours. I'm going to moderate the final panel, and I promise you that I will stay on the stage as long as there are questions to be asked. But how I wanted to start off this morning was to give you a sense of where I think we are to set the stage for all that follows. And what better way than to go back to the War of 1812, which started and made the U.S. Navy a world power. And we were pretty militant back then in our churches. And so what I did is I took a line from a church hymnal in the early 19th century. Next slide. On a delightsome spot, obviously this is a little modified, from other departments free, Lord, thou hast fixed our lot. We owe to thee the strength of our maritime band. How happy does our national fleet stand? That is my primary theme today. I want to talk about the maritime band, the Navy Marine Corps team, and the Coast Guard, the national fleet, and what we offer our nation, and what is so unique about this moment in time, which makes me so confident that the 21st century will be a golden age of American sea power. Next slide. Work, are you off your meds? We just took a $489 billion cut. The Marine Corps is being cut by 10%, from 202,000 to 182,100. The fleet stands at only 286 ships. Oh my God, and that's the worst that it's been since before World War II. We're decommissioning 7 cruisers and 2 LSDs, ships, cruisers, landing platforms by the end of their service lives. We've truncated the DDG-1000 program. We've canceled the CGX. And the LCS really isn't a warship. Ugh. What I'm going to try to do is tell you that, look, this is the devil talking. I think it was Secretary Lewis Johnson. He's not really in hell. But he did spend some time in purgatory for canceling the USS United States. Don't listen to him. Let's talk about this. Next one. So I'm going to tell you a story in 5 chapters, 5 parts. I'm going to talk to you about the nation's security foundation, the central and growing importance of the maritime commons to the global economy, the national security requirements at this strategic inflection point, the implications for our Navy Marine Corps team, and there's some concerns that keep me up at night. Hi, Dick. I want to take a GPS approach. You have to know where you are before you know where you're going. Next slide. I want to start this with a preface. In 1954, in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, Samuel P. Huntington presented a thesis. And what he said was that every single service has three key elements. The first is a strategic concept, which is a description of how, when, and where the military service or department expects to protect the nation against some threat to its security. Then its organizational structure, how it was going to form the resources given to it in the most important or the most effective way to achieve its strategic concept. And he asserted that if you had the right strategic concept and the organizational structure that was aligned to the national security needs of the time, then resources would inevitably flow to that service. And for the services who didn't get that right, the resources would not flow. Next slide. So the bottom line up front, as Huntington said, if a service does not possess a well-defined strategic concept, the public and political leaders will be confused as to the role of their service, uncertain of the necessity of their existence, and resources won't flow. And the bottom line up front, and this is the theme, is that our strategic concept and our organizational construct is precisely aligned with the strategic requirements of the 21st century. Next slide. So the foundation of our national security. We're in the fifth drawdown since the end of World War II. Everyone is rightly worried about it. But they're, I think, focused on the wrong aspect of this strategic drawdown, because it really is all about the connection between national security and our economy. Next slide. Here is the big picture. If this slide doesn't concern everyone in this room and every American citizen, then I'm just in the wrong place. Public debt is skyrocketing. Now, both the Democrats and the Republicans recognize this problem. As you know, there is a violent disagreement on how to address it. But both parties recognize that this problem must be solved because it is the foundation. Having a solid economy is the foundation upon which everything else rests. Next slide. So as I said, this is the fourth drawdown. The first one was the demobilization after World War II. Over 6,700 ships in commission. Can you imagine that? And 5 years later, on the eve of the Korean War, we had 634. An order of magnitude drawdown. All right. Well, we were just talking about this strategic inflection point that we find our nation at. And it has to do primarily with the perilous state of our finances and our economy, which everyone, as I said, on both sides of the aisle, know that we have to address. And the only problem is how we're going to address it. And I believe that will ultimately be decided after the presidential election and next year. But the fifth drawdown is tied inextricably to this point. Now, as you know, defense spending has gone in a sinusoidal pattern since the end of World War II, and this is the fifth build down. But it is tied not only to us coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, but it is tied specifically to this very big problem that we face. Next slide. So this is not a simple budget drill, which everyone seems to think it is. This truly is a strategic rebalancing. And the last time that I conceived that we really are in a situation like this was in 1953 when President Eisenhower came aboard. We were in a war. Did not have a balanced budget. Our economy had been racked by a large number of years of war over the previous period of time. And it was time to rebalance all of our national components of power. So after a decade of war, and as we rebuild the source of our strength, our economy, at home and abroad, it's time to restore the balance. That's all that this is about. Next slide. Now there's another part, and this is the military aspect of this. There's a very simple metric. It's called the war to peace ratio. It measures for every month that you're at war, or year you're at war, how many months or years you're at peace. Now the Cold War was 506 months long. 138 months were at war. So that meant for every month or year of war we had 2.67, almost 3 years of peace. That was one of the most militarily active periods of our country over a 42-year period. Since 1989, though, when the Cold War has ended, we've essentially been at war as much as we've been at peace. When you are at war that often, then it is unsurprising that we are now spending more money than we have at any time since the end of World War II in inflation-adjusted dollars. More money than we were spending when we were at war with the Communist Chinese on the Korean Peninsula. More money that we spent at any time in Vietnam, and more money that we spent at any time during the Reagan defense buildup. We topped out at $701 billion. So not only is defense going to contribute its share to restoring the national balance, we also are going to take this time to rebalance within the Department of Defense. Now, one thing that is very much different about this drawdown than the other drawdowns, and every single one of the service chiefs will tell you this, you can't buy as much with $701 billion as you could at $551 billion, primarily because the costs of our people have skyrocketed. Our operations and maintenance costs are increasing much faster than the rate of inflation. So that, even though it seems like a lot of money in the absolute sense, it's still very challenging for the service chiefs who are trying to create a program that works. Next slide. So, we're rebalancing our economy. So in the next 10 years, we hope, the enemy obviously has a vote, but we hope that we don't have another 100 or 200 or 300,000 troops doing a major nation-building operation. It's hideously expensive. We hope the enemy has a vote. But that's at least our plan. And everyone recognizes that the oceans now are central to the economy, which means they're central to our national strategy, probably more so than they have ever been in the past. Next slide. So United States Incorporated, $14 trillion and a GDP, market value of all the goods. Nearly 20% of the world's manufacturing, and our output is rising. We're home to 139 of the world's 500 largest companies, 2 more than any other country on the planet. We have 60% of the world reserves, and we're the world's largest trading nation. So getting out of this fix will require that we build upon the foundation of the globalized economy that was built at Bretton Woods. Next slide. There are 3 main requirements for future global growth. The first is ready, reliable information. I wish I could spend some time talking at length about the undersea cable network that is essentially the central nervous system of our economy, but time just won't allow me to do it. But let me just assert that without this fiber optic network that connects all of the peoples and all of the economies in the world, then the growth that we will need to fix this economic problem that we have would be very, very much more difficult. We need secure finances backed by stable economies, and we need free global trade. Those are the 3 basic requirements to get us out of this mess. Next slide. Now, transoceanic trade, in my view, is the fuel of the global economy. We've quadrupled since 1970, and since 1950, ocean trade has increased by 16 times, while world GDP has increased by 8. This is really the nutrients that keep our economies growing on a global scale and are absolutely critical. Next slide. So it's dependent on unimpeded access. This is AIS data. This is information data I think most of you know that are transponders from ships at sea. The red lines are the ones that are very dense. The blue lines are less dense. But you can see that these very much follow the global fiber optic network. Next slide. Maritime trade overview in 2010. 3,500 active ports, 38,000, nearly 48,000 trade-carrying ships, 8 billion tons of goods flowing across the oceans. A couple things to point out here. Top 200 ports, 51% of the port call, nearly 6/10, more than 6/10 of the deadweight tonnage. And this is the breakdown of what these ships are carrying. Next slide. So here is a snapshot of the 2011 trade overview, or this is what it looks like in the globe. A couple things I want to point out. First, 41% of all sea trade is oil or gas. About 22% of the value is being carried by tanker. I'm going to talk about that in a very quick period of time. But the air and the container traffic, we're in a revolution in the global trade industry. A combination of the RFID tag and containers. Containers at sea and air, which transports very high-value goods like pharmaceuticals, things like that. And together, they create global supply chains that we have never seen before, just-in-time logistics. Think of the world. Steve Carmel and Maersk calls the world's oceans now a global conveyor belt, an assembly line. It's much, much different than we've seen in the past. So let's just go through this very quickly. Next slide. The steady economy depends on a steady flow of oil. These are the world trade flows. You'll see that most of the arrows now to the United States come from the Atlantic Basin. We do not take most of our oil from the Persian Gulf, but the Persian Gulf is still absolutely critical, as you know, to the rest of the global economy. Next slide. All these energy trade routes pass through maritime choke points. The primary one starts with the Strait of Hormuz, where 17 million barrels of oil per day, 13 billion through the Maldives Passage. Then we come to the South China Sea, Malaccan Straits, South China Sea, and the Luzon Straits. That is critical to the world's economy. China is one of the biggest growing economies, and it is an engine that is going to help all of the world. Next slide. And what's different now is in 1947, we made the first offshore oil platform. Most of them were very close to the coasts. Now, 30% of oil production is found on the ocean floor. And they are in these specific locations all over the globe. 3,094 fields, 7,779 offshore platforms, 602 mobile drilling platforms. In World War II, the Germans were able to sever the Atlantic Coast oil transport network for about a month using submarines and going against tankers. That essentially was a pipeline at sea. Now, if you sink these platforms in the oceans, you're cutting both transportation, because often they feed directly into a transportation network, and you're cutting production. That's new. Next slide. So there are more and more of these very vulnerable, highly expensive, enormous floating production, storage, and offloading systems at sea. Next slide. So everyone knows about how important oil is, but I think few Americans realize how important the container has become to our economy. World traffic container traffic from 1995 to 2008 has nearly tripled. 90% of all value of U.S. imports arrives in a container. And in 2008, these 20-foot equivalent units, we were handling 77,000 per day, of which 30,000 were imports. Here's just a couple quotes. Here are some of the biggest companies in the world. The supply chain is the biggest leverage point we have. Zara, a Spanish clothing manufacturer. The supply chain is the business model. International trading company Li & Fung. Customer value lies in our ability to architect and operate these supply chains, which are absolutely dependent on RFID tags and containers. Next slide. So as a result, container traffic continues to grow. These are the big gateways of the world's economy. These list every single port which handles more than 1 million 20-foot equivalent units per year. And some of these gateways, the Hong Kong gateway, you can just see is enormous. The Taiwan gateway, the Shanghai gateway. In the United States, it's California, New York, and Puget Sound gateways. These locations are very, very critical now and important nodes in our economy, the global economy. Next slide. And the ships are getting enormous. Maersk just let 10, a contract for 10 Triple-E class, 13,1,200 feet long, 200 feet longer than an aircraft carrier. They carry 18,000 18,000 20-foot equivalent units. These are behemoths. And it's becoming more and more and more efficient and globally dispersed. Next slide. Now, the Panama Canal expansion. Everyone is talking about how the Arctic is going to become a new traffic lane. But what's going to happen in our lifetime, and what our admirals are going to have to worry about, is the Panama Canal expansion. It's very difficult to see. Let me just point out two things. One, right now you can take a ship through the Panama Canal that carries about 4,400 TEUs. At the end of the expansion program, you're going to carry 12,000 TEUs on every ship. Or you could if you wanted to. And you're going to have 3 locks, so what's going to happen is you're going to double the capacity. Next slide. This is going to have a big, big impact because now you can have direct service from Asia directly to the East Coast without very much of a problem. You can have around-the-world service because Capesize, those ships that have a draft that are big enough to fit through the Suez Canal, and Suezmax, those oilers that can fit through the Suez Canal, will now be able to fit through the Panama Canal. So you are going to have an enormous impact on global trade patterns. Next slide. That is the next big thing. That might happen 20 or 30 years from now. And you might never see as big of an impact as we think of it. We could. So this means that in the next 20 to 30 to 40 years, U.S. naval officers of all persuasions are going to have to determine how the Panama Canal and the Arctic will change global trading patterns. And they will have an enormous difference. Next slide. Now, the threat to the global commons is probably at the lowest level that it's been since 1890. There is no Navy that is building an enormous trade interdiction fleet. Not a single one. But there's a lot of bad things that travel over the ocean because bad guys know that buoyancy counts. So 90% of all the drug trade goes over the ocean. Female trafficking, counterfeit consumer goods, smuggling of immigrants, counterfeit medicines, wildlife. It's all going over the oceans. So it's not so much now of building navies to protect the sea lanes. It's about knowing what's going on in the oceans and taking action to make sure that there are no bad things that happen. Next slide. Now, as this global trading pattern is extremely resilient. Extremely resilient. It can reconfigure itself on the fly, but it is very susceptible to spikes in freight rates. So what you're trying to do is minimize these spikes, which costs everyone in the economy and slows economic growth down. These are just some of the key freight spikes since World War I. And so you can see deterring war is a very, very big aspect of trying to get the global economy back on track. And also you're trying to take care of these perturbations in the system that you might be able to respond to and alleviate the crisis. Next slide. Okay. So we have to fix our economy, the global economy and the U.S. economy. The oceans are now increasingly central to that goal. It's a strategic imperative. So what are the national security requirements at this strategic inflection point? Obviously, if you take a $489 billion cut over 10 years, what you're going to do is lose some capacity. But we want to have the most capable force in the world. At the end of this, we want to have the best Navy, the best Marine Corps, the best Army, the best Air Force, the best Special Operations Forces. They will unquestionably be smaller. We are trading capacity for capability. Next slide. And this is what our strategic guidance tells us. If you haven't read this, it's in your briefcase. I enjoin all of you to do so. It tells us to maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, if possible, with a smaller nuclear force. What does this mean for the Navy Marine Corps team? That the future of our Ohio replacement program, the SSB&X, our ballistic missile submarines, is absolutely critical to our basic strategic deterrent posture, along with the other legs of our triad. But the most secure leg of the triad is the boomer force. It tells us to sustain freedom of access through the global commons. because it ties the health of the United States and the global economy directly to this access. It doesn't say secure the commons, it says provide access to the commons. It tells us to sustain global freedom of action in these anti-access area denial networks. Essentially what happens is we're moving from unguided weapons warfare to guided weapons warfare on a global scale. For the last 15 to 20 years, the United States has had a monopoly in this regime. We are losing that monopoly. Other adversaries, potential adversaries, are buying guided weapons and battle networks that will allow them to employ them over longer range. It tells us we have to maintain freedom of action even in the face of these. We rebalance our forces to the Asia-Pacific region, traditionally a maritime theater, still a maritime theater. Vast distances. Naval and aerospace forces are absolutely critical in this region. It tells us to rely on non-military and means and military cooperation to address instability rather than big footprints of troops on the ground. That's enormously different than in the past 10 years. Next slide. It tells us to develop a strategic relationship with India. Secretary of Defense Panetta was just there. The CNO went before him. The Secretary of the Navy has gone. India sees itself as the bulwark of security in the Indian Ocean. We do too. That means that over time, I think our maritime connection between our two countries will grow. It's not certain, but I think it's a safe bet. We're going to maintain our allied presence in the Middle East, but with less emphasis on boots on the ground. If you talk with General Mattis, the commanding officer of CENTCOM now, he describes CENTCOM, the Central Command area of responsibility, as a maritime theater. We're reducing our land-based posture in Europe while we're increasing our forward presence in Europe. I'll talk about that later. And we're going to pursue innovative low-cost and small footprint approaches around the world. And who is better than that than the Navy Marine Corps team? No one. Next slide. We are also entering what is called an expeditionary posture. Most of the combat power of the United States is going to be in the continental United States or on the territory of the United States. Next build. So if you take a look at this, we're only going to have 3 Army BCTs based overseas. Only 3. A striker brigade in Europe, an airborne brigade in Italy, and a heavy brigade in Korea. Of course, they're going to have a substantial number of troops in the Pacific, which is because we were balancing our forces in that regard. Next slide. The Air Force is the same way. They're only going to have about 12 to 14 squadrons based overseas. This is totally different than the garrison posture we had in the Cold War. This is an expeditionary posture. And in an expeditionary posture, naval forces are naturally advantaged because you have to go across the oceans. Next slide. So, what are the implications for the Navy Marine Corps team? So far, things are looking pretty good. The oceans are absolutely central. You have to need a strong Navy Marine Corps team to maintain access. The implications of our strategy says you need a strong Navy Marine Corps forces. And you could have taken this right out of the 21st century cooperative strategy for 21st century sea power. It says, look, the connective tissues we have got to make sure that we take care of. So I would argue right now that this, in terms of national strategy, is the best it's been since 1890 when we started building the Navy second to none. Next. So, some basic principles. You don't need to secure the commons. The threat to ocean trade over the commons is relatively low. It could raise in the future, but right now it's relatively low. You have to identify the threats that are moving over the commons, which means you need to have global maritime domain awareness and you need strong global partnerships, which is what the Navy has really been focused on since 2007 when they created the Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Sea Power. Naval officers and Marine officers see farther into the future. They see these broad global trends. They're out, tooling about. And maritime global partnerships are absolutely critical to helping us identify the threats. You have to be able to respond quickly to the disruptions. You operate forward. Our Navy Marine Corps team will operate forward in conjunction with our partners. And we need to assure access in the commons, in peacetime for trade, in wartime for access for the entire joint force. Next slide. Now, increasingly, this is where the UN Law of the Sea comes in. Increasingly, assuring access is going to be about lawfare. It's going to be about people making claims on the ocean that will disrupt access for other players. If you aren't at that table with the UN law of the sea, then you are losing one of the key arrows in your quiver. And that is why Secretary Panetta is the first Secretary of Defense to testify in front of the Foreign Relations Committee on the importance of the UN law of the sea. The Arctic, you see this all the time. There's also another location, next slide, as you all know, the South China Sea. Now these are quotes directly from Secretary Panetta's Shangri-La speech. As a Pacific power, we have a national interest in the freedom of navigation across the globe, a national U.S. interest in global freedom of navigation, and unimpeded economic development and the rule of law, because that is central to the strategy. And we believe it is critical for the regional institutions to develop and protect the rights of all nations for free and open access. It is part of our global and national strategy. So we've got a lot of work to do in the South China Sea. All of us know that. We have a lot of work to do in the Arctic, and we need the UN law of the sea to help us achieve the aims that we would like to see for everyone in the globe. Next slide. Now in wartime, we have to deal with what are called anti-access area denial networks. We have two growing anti-access area denial networks in our primary theaters, the Western Pacific and Central Command. All it is that countries are buying a lot of guided weapons and the battle networks to employ them. So the littoral area, we used to call the littoral area, we used to say maybe the continental shelf inward. When the bad guy has a missile that can reach out maybe 1,000 nautical miles, a cruise missile, a ballistic missile, an aircraft with missiles, whatever, when does the littoral start and the open oceans end? Hard to tell. But we have this expanded contested maritime battle space. Next slide. So here's our strategic concept. This might not be the right wording, but I hope it gets the sense. With all of that as buildup, we are a Navy Marine Corps team. We're part of a national fleet. We are built and ready for war. This is a war-fighting Navy and a war-fighting Marine Corps, because that is the best way to deter war. We will operate forward to keep the peace. We will preserve American, allied, and global interests, and we will provide access both in peacetime and wartime when necessary. Why can we claim this strategic concept, which is relatively expansive? Because the Navy Marine Corps team and its Coast Guard partner are the absolute best at globally dispersed expeditionary operations. Low cost, unobtrusive presence. We take what we need, we operate at the sea, very low footprint. You put Marines ashore, they have a very, very low footprint. Our core competencies, I would argue, are two. One I would call distributed operations, maneuver and waiting. A relatively small fleet of 300 ships can operate throughout the globe, and they can maneuver when necessary to concentrate in any theater or any point to bring overwhelming combat power. Once there, they can do disaggregated networked operations. I was just in Afghanistan. I talked with Major General Tulin, who has now been relieved. I said, what is the record for a single Marine battalion? Maybe 800 to 900 Marines. The single record of a battalion spreading itself out across a battlefield with combat outposts. Anybody want to hazard a guess? How many people would guess 25? 30? 50? 77. That's the record, a single battalion. And the way they can do that is because the Marines trust their people. We'll put a sergeant or a corporal where other services might put a lieutenant. We will give them the backing they need in terms of logistics and fires and information, and you can disaggregate, and that's why a force of 17,000 Marines can exert influence over an area the size of the state of Mississippi. We're the guarantor of access to the maritime global commons in peacetime, and with the Air Force, we are the guarantor of access in the early parts of the stage. And the way I would say this is air-sea battle is all about creating the conditions so the joint force can come in, and the U.S. Marine Corps, believe me, a requirement for a joint forcible entry operation is absolutely critical in this world. In an expeditionary posture, you have to keep it. And we're ideally matched for the challenges in PACOM and CENTCOM. Next slide. Now, our organizational construct is we're not just going to count the number of ships in the Navy's battle force. We're going to consider the maritime power, an aggregation of all of our maritime power, and we call it the National Fleet. It's the Navy Marine Corps team. I use the term Fleet Marine Forces because of the National Fleet. The Marine is an essential part of our National Fleet. It includes all of these things: the Coast Guard, our Transoceanic Lift Fleet. A.D. Baker III thinks that the United States conservatively has about 95% of the world's militarily useful sea lift. We take our joint force with us because we're in an expeditionary posture. We have a special mission fleet and a very vibrant industrial base. All of this is part of the National Fleet. The Navy Marine Corps team, as part of this fleet, next slide, is changing itself into what I refer to as a total force battle network. We used to call it ForceNet. Now it's even much more vibrant. We're going to optimize the network, not the platform. We're not going to spend $8 billion on a CGX because the power of the network makes sure that you don't have to spend that much money on any single platform. All platforms are sensors. All sensors are netted. All relative information gets to the warfighter. And we focus on sensors and payloads rather than the trucks. That's all they are. They're trucks. Reconfigurable forces and platforms. The MAGTF is the most reconfigurable organization, combat-wise, in the world on the ground. We have open architecture combat systems to allow us to upgrade very quickly. We have reconfigurable modular payload bays, so you can put anything in it. You want special operations forces? Do that. What can you make of this? I can make a hat. I can make a brooch. You know, it's just, I guess you haven't seen Airplane. God, it's one of my favorite movies. This thing is just unbelievably capable. And we look at second stage systems. Our trucks carry second stage systems which push out combat power over a wide variety. It's almost like infiltration tactics in World War I. And then these second stage systems might even carry third stage systems. So a second stage 40-foot USV might come off a littoral combat ship, go out and put out 3 third stage USVs, unmanned surface vehicles, and create a network around the ship. You can do it with unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned underwater vehicles, it doesn't matter. Next one. The power of the network is greater than the sum of its parts. You have an interneted sensor grid with national systems and joint sensors. You have a new maritime patrol and reconnaissance force. You have command, control, communications, computers and cyber networks and intelligence. You're going towards single integrated operation pictures. You have multi-domain effects nets with networked enabled weapons. FTM-15, a TIPI-2 Army radar, takes a look at a ballistic missile headed towards an area defended by a ship. The ship never sees it's on its sensors. It engages on remote, totally from the information of a forward-based sensor, and achieves an intercept. Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, an E-2 Delta radar, will be able to look deep, and the SM-6 active missile will be able to engage low observable cruise missile targets at 150 nautical miles out. In other words, the E-2D, the airborne sensor, is probably the most important sensor in the battle network. It's no longer on a ship. We just had a test in which a Tomahawk land attack missile was targeted by an Air Force F-22 to an SSGN, a submarine with a lot of Tomahawks. The Tomahawk fires off. The F-22 retargets it in flight. It goes to the target area, and a Navy FNA-18 E&F changes the final grid of the attack, all in flight, networked-enabled weapons. This allows us to focus on the network and not platforms. Why did we cancel the CGX? It was too darn expensive as an individual platform. We could recreate the sensor we needed to do would have done. Next slide. And then we have all these basic trucks. We have small trucks, medium trucks, large, extra large, and extra, extra large. Like I said, what do you want to put in it? You want to put special operations? Do that. You want to put Marines? Do that. You want to put humanitarian assistance, disaster relief stuff? Do that. You want anti-submarine warfare capability? Do that. All of these can just be mixed and matched. And we call this a strategy of a second move. We can reconfigure our fleet faster than a potential bad guy can build ships. Next slide. And because we know the value of maritime partnerships, we're in a position unlike very few naval powers in the past. 17 of the next 19 largest navies are democracies. Most of them are either treaty allies or friends or strategic partners. This is an enormous capability, which is why the Navy Marine Corps teams spend so much time in building these partnerships, because 17 of the 19 largest navies are democracies, and the other two realize how important the oceans are too. They have a stake in this global intermodal system. Next slide. And the secret of our TFBN is our people. A Marine sergeant comes over the hill in Afghanistan. He's leading a patrol. Down on a plane below him are a bunch of Afghani nationals that are doing something that looks suspicious on the road. There's a donkey cart, a whole bunch of stuff in the back. They seem like they're digging something and maybe placing an IED. But the rules of engagement don't make, this is a sergeant. He's out there. He's got to make a decision. Do I engage? No. His rules of engagement say do not engage. You are not certain. So he brings his squad down the hill. Of course, the Afghani nationals see him and disperse, leaving the donkey in the donkey cart. The sergeant comes up. Everyone's looking at him. Sergeant, what do we do? Unhook the donkey. Let's follow it. They unhook the donkey, and the donkey goes to a village. Guess who's there? The ne'er-do-wells who were indeed planning IEDs. And the sergeant and his team capture them. Sergeant goes back to the combat outpost. The lieutenant looks at him and says, Sergeant, that was brilliant. What made you think of that? Sir, I was raised on a farm, and I'm a sergeant in the Marine Corps. I've been following jackasses my whole life. That tells you all you need to know about our people. They're mission-oriented. They're mission-oriented. They're very innovative. They're adaptable. They're unafraid to make decisions. And they're irreverent. I mean, they just love kind of screwing with you all the time because they're so darn good. These people are just unbelievably talented. And they are the true secret weapon of our total force battle network. Next slide. So here's what it's going to look like in 2020, inshallah. Next slide. The U.S. Coast Guard is going to be the primary interdefense zone, which makes sure that none of that bad stuff crossing the oceans is going to get to the continental United States. They'll operate with us forward often, but they will be the primary interdefense zone. Next slide. Now our U.S. fleets and our MORFOR laydown across the globe, generally along the equator, in the theaters we need to be, operating forward. Next slide. We're going to have 4 DDGs in Rota. We're going to have land-based anti-missile capabilities in Romania and Poland. We're going to have LCS, MCMs, mine countermeasure ships, patrol craft, and Coast Guard cutters in the Gulf, maintaining access, protecting offshore oil platforms. We're going to have a tender in Diego Garcia. We're going to be able to forward station LCSs in Singapore. We're going to have 3 SSNs in Guam with another tender, and we're going to have a whole bunch of forces in Japan. A big portion of our fleet is based overseas, stationed overseas. Whereas the Air Force and the Army are coming back, the Navy's going out. This is an expeditionary posture. Next slide. You add in the Marine Corps MPS RONs and the Maritime Prepositioning Force, or the prepositioning up in Norway, and Marines can collapse an awful lot of power, concentrate an awful lot of power in any theater very, very quickly because of where they're located. Next slide. We have all sorts of major port access agreements throughout the Eurasian and African land masses. Next slide. We have BAMs, which now provide that maritime domain awareness. These BAMs, which can operate in 5 locations, 2,000 nautical miles from the base, 24/7, 365 days a year, will provide enormous maritime domain access, much more than you could provide with frigates. Next slide. The first pouncers on a high-value asset that we might be worried about will be P-8s. Going from the old P-3 to the P-8 is like going from the diesel to the nuclear submarine. The P-8 is air refuelable. It can stay in the sky a lot longer. It operates farther rather than diving deeper. It's faster. It goes 100 knots faster. It has an extraordinary sensor suite. And then the P-8s and the BAMs are designed to operate within 24 hours from a cooperative security location. Next slide. This looks pretty darn good to me. This provides us with enormous maritime domain access and allows a fleet of about 300 ships to really do what our nation requires us to do. Next slide. Next slide. Hopefully next slide. So, I've told you all the good stuff. I'm not here to tell you that everything is goodness and light. There are things that keep me up at night. Everyone's heard me say this. I sleep like a baby. I wake up crying every 2 hours. I worry about further budget cuts. We can just about manage what we need to do with the resources that we have now. I worry about sequestration. I worry about other cuts beyond sequestration. In the near term, General Dunford, General Amos, Admiral Greenert, and Admiral Ferguson, I and the Secretary deal with three primary kind of problems. The first one is to make sure the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Navy, Marine Corps team reconstitutes and resets itself after 10 hard years of war. That's kind of the near-term fiscal problem that we're faced with. In the midterm, we got to get the Joint Strike Fighter into serial production at a cost we can afford. That will unhinge our program if we don't get that right. We are doing everything we can to make sure that happens. And then in the 1920s, we're going to be reconstituting the Ohio replacement, the SSB and X, which will replace all our Ohios, and we got to make sure that that doesn't just eat away for the rest of the Navy Marine Corps team. You'll hear probably General Dunford talk about wholeness this afternoon. It consumes us. People who say, let's buy another 100 ships, we've got to make sure we have the right manning, the right O&M, the right ordnance levels to make sure that the fleet that we have can do what is asked of it because we are built and ready for war. Lack of strategic restraint. Wow, the request for forces process, just give us more ships. We are the biggest and oldest, one of the biggest and oldest global corporations on the planet. We provide a product that is in high demand. People can't get enough of it. But they're asking for it, and we try like heck to make sure we can give it to them. But it's expensive, and it's hard. We need to get control of this process. And we need more time to think about what all about this construct. Is it the right one? People would make you think that the biggest problem we're faced is whether we buy one or two LCSs. Look, what we need to talk about is these big things. We need to talk about, is our strategic concept right? We need to talk about, is our organizational construct right? We need to find out how do we do air-sea battle? How do we do joint forcible entry operations? Those are the things that we should be talking about in this room. Next slide. But all in all, I do believe we're in a delightful spot. The importance of the oceans to the health and vitality of the U.S. and global system is growing, and our national leaders recognize it. President Obama certainly does. Governor Romney says that he is going to build the Navy. People on both sides of the aisle are asking, how can we buy more subs? How can we buy more cruisers and destroyers? What do we need to do? How can we help you? National leaders recognize this and are willing to try. I think they're willing to put the resources there. We have a maritime-friendly strategic environment at the strategic and operational level. We have an appropriate strategic concept. We have a great organizational construct. We have a vibrant industrial base, the best damn people on the face of the planet, and just enough resources to make it work. Next slide. So sing it with me. On a delightsome spot, from other departments free. Sorry, Air Force and Army. Lord, thou hast fixed our lot. We owe to thee the strength of our maritime band. How happy does our national fleet stand? Ladies and gentlemen, this is an exciting time. If you aren't excited, you don't have a pulse. This is a great time to be in the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. As I said, we're one of the oldest and most capable and successful corporations on the planet. We provide and organize, train, and equip a Navy Marine Corps team that is built and ready for war, operated forward to preserve the peace. COCOMs and national leaders can't get enough of it. I look forward to the discussion on the next several days. As I said, I purposely did not want to talk. I didn't want to get a question on the LCS in the first hour. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to moderate the panel on fleet design. I will stay on the stage until the last question is answered. What I want to do is hear from the great speakers that John and the Naval War College have lined up. I'll be here with you. If you have questions, come up and talk with me at the breaks. I'll be here tonight for 2 hours. I will answer any question that you have, and if I can't give you the answer, I'll find out about it and get it back to you. I applaud you all to be here. I'd like to thank the Foundation for their help in this great institution. I'd like to thank John and Ambassador Peters and all of the people who make this place the cradle of naval thought. I look forward to the next 2 days, and thank you all so much for everything that you do for our nation. Thank you.